Welcome back, everyone, to the third episode of our look at Napoleon's Marshals from Epic History. Definitely want to encourage you to check out Epic History and watch all of their great content if you are enjoying this series and have enjoyed anything that we've covered from Epic History. If you didn't see the first two episodes of our look at his Marshals, there's a link in the description that will take you back to episode 1. The link is also there for the original content. We want to support our original content creators whenever possible. Let's go ahead and dive into part 3.
So far, we've met Marshals Perignon, Brune, Serrurier, Kellerman, Grouchy, Moncey, Poniatowski, Jourdan, Bernadotte, Augereau, Lefebvre, Mortier, and Marmont.
Top 13 to go.
13. Marshal Saint-Cyr.
I love these quotes that we get from Napoleon about each of these guys. It really gives us some insight into what he thought of them, at least at that moment. He's the best man among us in the line of defense, though I am superior to him in attack. This reminds me a little bit of how General Grant described George Thomas. He said if you needed a position held and defended, Thomas was your guy. But he wasn't nearly aggressive enough on attack. And you know what? That's some generals. Some generals are naturally more suited to certain roles than to others.
Gouvion Saint-Cyr was a gifted student who ran away from a miserable childhood to become an artist. A passionate Republican, he embraced the French Revolution and later volunteered for military service.
Interesting that he left home to become an artist in Italy. That was his first love. That probably gives us some insight into how he sees the world.
Though proud and aloof by nature, his Republican politics and sharp intellect ensured he was elected captain of his company. His skill at drawing enemy positions then got him noticed by General Custine, who gave...
So you notice it said he was elected captain. I don't know exactly how it went in revolutionary France, but this was a common thing when you are building a much bigger army and you suddenly have a massive need for more officers. This is why a lot of these guys, like Napoleon, are able to rise through the ranks so fast. Guys that were junior officers suddenly become colonels and even generals. And that happened a lot in the American Civil War. Guys that were lieutenants and captains in 1860 are 3- and 4-star generals in 1861. So you have that. But you also have the need to fill even more of those like lieutenants and captains ranks, and often that was done by election. It was by who was popular. It was who were the men willing to follow.
Gave him a job on his staff. During these turbulent early years of the Revolution, Custine was one of several generals who was punished for defeat with a trip to the guillotine. Saint-Cyr's instinctive grasp of warfare, brilliant planning and tactics won him promotion from volunteer to general of division in 2 years.
I mean, this seems to be a common theme, doesn't it? These guys rising through the ranks rapidly. This is where the cream is rising to the top in many cases.
An even more remarkable achievement, as he'd had no formal military training.
Right, unlike guys like Napoleon who had gone to military school.
But his cold, analytical approach meant that he was always a respected leader, rather than loved. After 5 years' service with the Army of the Rhine, he was sent to Italy. At the disastrous Battle of Novi, he commanded the French right wing, but skillfully extricated his troops from the debacle. The next year he was back on the Rhine and won a brilliant victory over the Austrians at Bibrach. But a bitter dispute with his commander, General Murat, encouraged rumours that Saint-Cyr was impossible to work with.
Sometimes when someone says, that guy's impossible to work with, they're actually the one who's impossible to work with. There's a lot of different ways this phrase is used, and I'll use the PG version of it. But I think I first heard it on a quote in my favorite TV show, Justified. But again, I'm giving the PG version. You meet a jerk in the morning, you met a jerk. You meet jerks all day, you're the jerk.
Cyr believed soldiers should not meddle in politics, and did not support Napoleon's seizure of power in 1799. nor did he show much enthusiasm for Napoleon's decision to crown himself emperor 5 years later.
Might be why he didn't get one of the initial marshal slots in 1804.
His political views cost him dearly. Saint-Cyr was sidelined for several years, while less able generals were made marshals. In 1805, he commanded French forces in central Italy. But when he was made subordinate to Marshal Massena, a man whom he personally detested, he returned to Paris, even when Napoleon threatened to have him shot for desertion.
Which is funny because Napoleon did those kinds of things too. Could very well have been shot himself for desertion early on in his career for some things he did. One of the things I've noticed about Saint-Cyr compared to some of these other guys is that he isn't serving directly under Napoleon in a lot of these major battles where Napoleon's making a name for himself. He seems like he was much more independent in command or served under other people. He's not at places like Austerlitz or in Napoleon's Italian campaign serving under him, things like that.
In 1808, Saint-Cyr was given command of a corps for the invasion of Spain, but his failure to take Girona meant he was relieved of command. Leaving in a fury before his replacement, Marshal Oudinot, had arrived, he was nearly court-martialed again for desertion. Saint-Cyr's military talent, however, was not in doubt. In 1812, he was recalled for the Russia campaign, with command of 6th Bavarian Corps.
So here he is serving directly under Napoleon, and this is when he gets made a marshal. It's when Napoleon's working with him firsthand.
His role was to support Marshal Oudinot in guarding the northern flank of the French salient. When Wittgenstein's Russians attacked at Polotsk, Oudinot was wounded, and Saint-Cyr took over command, turning probable defeat into a brilliant victory.
There you go.
For this achievement, Napoleon awarded Saint-Cyr his Marshal's baton. But 2 months later, at a second Battle of Polotsk, Saint-Cyr was attacked by a larger Russian army, seriously wounded in the foot and forced to pull back. His injury meant he missed the worst horrors of the Russian retreat, but he contracted typhus early in 1813 and was sick for many months. Saint-Cyr returned to the Grande Armée in August, taking command of 14th Corps and the defense of Dresden.
It continues to amaze me that in the aftermath of Russia, Napoleon was able to throw together another massive army. But of course, people who downplay Napoleon's achievements tend to point to some of these last years and how he started to get beat. But you got to remember that he lost his entire army, granted by his own decision to march on Moscow. And you can't take that away from the fact that he made that choice. And he had opportunities in this window where he could have held on to his empire if he would have just backed down, and he didn't do that. So we have to criticize Napoleon for that. But remember the force he's working with at this point. He's lost entire armies and has built another one from scratch and still somehow manages sometimes to win victories.
Incredibly, this was the first and only time that he worked directly alongside the emperor, and both soon learned new respect for each other's abilities. Saint-Cyr's skilled defense of Dresden set the stage for Napoleon's great victory there later that month. But Saint-Cyr was incredulous when Napoleon later ordered him to remain in Dresden, while other forces concentrated for the decisive Battle of Leipzig, 60 miles to the west. Napoleon's defeat at Leipzig meant that Saint-Cyr and other garrisons in the east were cut off and had to surrender that autumn. Saint-Cyr took no part in the 100 Days, determined to keep out of France's political disputes. Under the restored monarchy, he served as Minister of War and tried, but failed, to save Marshal Ney from the death penalty. He also struggled to enact military reforms in the face of royalist opposition.
So it's interesting. I'm trying to get a sense of the man. And, so he didn't participate in the 100 Days. He doesn't work with Napoleon directly that much. But he also is willing to step up and defend Marshal Ney, who had sided with Napoleon in the 100 Days and then paid for it with his life. and that could have cost him his own career, Saint-Cyr, to do that.
Eventually resigning in disgust and retiring to his country estate. Marshal Saint-Cyr remains one of the great what-ifs of the Napoleonic Wars.
That's fair.
An extremely able commander sidelined for his politics, who might well have proved one of Napoleon's very best marshals. 12. Marshal Oudinot.
A decent fellow, but not very bright.
Nicolas Oudinot ran away to join the army aged 17, but his father dragged him home 3 years later to help run the family business.
Now this guy, as I look at major battles, he's at some of the big ones later on. Austerlitz, Friedland, Wagram. Enlists as a private in 1784. So another guy who rises all the way through the ranks to become a marshal, son of a brewer.
When the revolution began, he volunteered for the National Guard and was promoted to major. In the wars that followed, he served with the Army of the Rhine, always in the thick of the fighting, rapidly promoted and frequently wounded, a habit for which he became celebrated. In 1799, he was promoted to General of Division.
So he's actually coming to division command later than some of these other guys. That's kind of interesting. He's a brigade commander when a lot of these other guys are divisions or even army commanders. Yeah, you have to think. I mean, I never served in the military, but if I'm in a unit that's under a general and there's this lore about how he's always right in the thick of the fighting, always seems to get wounded but is still there, I mean, that's going to inspire your men, and that's going to cause you to want to follow a guy like that who takes a beating and keeps on going.
And sent to Switzerland to serve as General Massena's new chief of staff, a role he performed to perfection. Serving with General Bagun in Italy, he led a cavalry charge against an Austrian battery at the Battle of Monzembano, sabering gunners and capturing one cannon himself.
Think about this. This guy's a division commander, and he's riding into battle in a cavalry charge, and he's cutting guys down with his sword. That's inspiring stuff.
A feat for which Napoleon awarded him a Sword of Honor. In 1805, the newly crowned Emperor Napoleon gave Oudinot command of an elite grenadier division formed from the tallest, strongest soldiers in the army. In December that year, at the Battle of Austerlitz, Oudinot insisted on leading the division in person, despite having been shot in the thigh 2 weeks earlier. His grenadiers were kept in reserve for most of the battle, but saw heavy fighting in the latter stages, as Napoleon completed the destruction of the Allied left wing.
So on one hand, I find myself like thinking, man, this guy's hardcore. But at the same time, when you rise to a certain level of command, you have a responsibility to take care of yourself. I know that, you have the likes of Winfield Scott Hancock at Gettysburg saying, there are times when a corps commander's life does not count. Well, yeah, if you're a great general and your leadership is needed, then your life does count, and you need to be safe.
At the Siege of Danzig in 1807, General Oudinot's division had the unusual distinction of capturing an enemy warship.
That's awesome.
A British sloop that had run aground trying to resupply the city. A month later, at Friedland, Oudinot and his grenadiers were under Marshal Lannes's command and played a crucial role holding up the Russian army, until Napoleon arrived to deal a decisive blow. During the 1809 war with Austria, Oudinot was wounded once more at the Battle of Aspern. When Marshal Lannes died of his wounds, Napoleon chose Oudinot to succeed him as commander of 2nd Corps. He led his new corps with such success at Wagram 6 weeks later that Napoleon attributed victory to Massena and Oudinot. A week later, he became one of 3 new marshals, one for France, one for the army, one for friendship. Oudinot, the army's choice, fearless and much loved, a man whose courage inspired all around him.
See, that's what I'm saying. I mean, when you say for the army, that makes sense. This guy, and Napoleon's the same way. Napoleon's very brave. Later on, obviously, he doesn't risk himself nearly as much, but early on, especially, he does when he's in a similar role to Oudinot. He's a guy who inspires his men, and they want to fight for a guy like that.
He later received an additional reward, the title Duke of Reggio. In 1812, Marshal Oudinot led 2nd Corps into Russia, but was wounded again at Polotsk and handed over command to General Saint-Cyr. 10 weeks later, he was back with his corps, marching south to join up with Napoleon's army on its retreat from Moscow. Oudinot's men were shocked when they saw their old comrades from the main column. They looked more like fugitives than soldiers of the Grande Armée. Since Oudinot's 2nd Corps was in better shape than most, it formed the vanguard for the desperate crossing of the Berezina River.
So just in case you're not familiar with these terms, anytime you hear the word vanguard or the van, you're in front. You're the lead.
But the next day, in bitter fighting to hold the bridgehead against the Russians, Oudinot was shot from his saddle.
Jeez.
He was carried back to a cottage with a serious gunshot wound.
This guy is wounded a lot. He's definitely putting himself in the thick of it regularly.
But then he and his party became surrounded by Cossacks. Oudinot asked for his pistols, and from his bed, aiming through an opening opposite, began firing at the Cossacks.
I absolutely love this guy. He's definitely my favorite so far of the people that we've talked about.
They were rescued by friendly troops, just in time.
Jeez, that's awesome.
Oudinot was back with the Grande Armée in Germany in 1813. In August, Napoleon ordered him to lead an advance on Berlin, but he was defeated by Bernadotte's Army of the North at Grossbeeren.
Two Napoleon's marshals going at each other.
He
wonder if he knew
retreated
Bernadotte.
in the wrong direction, causing Napoleon to remark, "It's truly difficult to have less brains than the Duke of Reggio."
So he's brave, he's inspiring, maybe not so smart. But Napoleon obviously is in a very dark place in 1813 after the debacle of Russia, and I imagine he's being more critical than he otherwise might have been under the circumstances.
In Oudinot's defense, he'd probably been given an impossible task.
There you go.
Insufficient men to take on a strong opponent, bad weather, terrible roads, and he himself unwell, possibly not yet recovered from his ordeal in Russia.
Do you think?
Napoleon put Oudinot back where he was most effective, leading troops in combat under his close supervision.
Yeah, see, some guys, a great example of this for me is George Patton. George Patton is a guy who, brave, no doubt of that, audacious, willing to take the fight to the enemy, but not the guy you want at the top of the chain of command. He works best when there's a stabilizing influence above him who can rein him in when the time calls for it. You need people like that, but you don't put them in charge of an entire campaign.
At Leipzig, he commanded 2 divisions of the Young Guard, engaged in heavy fighting on the southern front for 2 days. Oudinot continued to serve the Emperor courageously and loyally as a corps commander in the final campaign of 1814. But in April, he was one of several marshals to confront Napoleon with the reality of his position and force his abdication. When Napoleon returned from exile in 1815, Oudinot refused to break his new oath to the monarchy, but declared neutrality, telling Napoleon, "Since I shall not serve you, sire, I shall serve no one."
I can respect that. He's saying, listen, and maybe it's self-serving to do that, but he didn't oppose him, and he at least reached out to him directly and expressed himself. I can respect that.
He continued to hold senior commands under the Bourbons,
Which he probably wouldn't have been able to do had he sided with Napoleon.
By one estimate, Oudinot was wounded 36 times in his military career, more than any other marshal.
More than probably mostly any other soldier ever. My gosh.
That we found details for. A fellow officer who bathed with him at a spa after the war saw the scars on his body and observed,
Wait, I want to go back and look at that for a second.
at a spa.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 gunshot wounds, a couple of grape shot wounds, saber wounds, a broken leg. My goodness.
After the war, saw the scars on his body and observed he was little more than a colander.
A colander.
Ironically,
wow.
Oudinot was also one of the longest-lived marshals, dying aged 80 while serving as governor of Les Invalides.
Seems to be a common role for a lot of those guys. Man, I really like Oudinot. He's my favorite so far for sure.
11. Marshal Victor.
Victor was better than one might suppose.
Claude Victor Perrin was an experienced soldier by the time of the French Revolution, a sergeant with 8 years' service in the Grenoble artillery regiment. The Revolutionary Wars brought the opportunity for rapid promotion, and by 1793 he was commanding an infantry battalion at the siege of Toulon.
So this is where Napoleon makes a name for himself.
He led a daring night assault on British defences alongside the army's artillery chief, a young Major Bonaparte. Both men were wounded, but the attack was a success, and both were quickly promoted to Brigadier General. Victor served under General Bonaparte in Italy, and turned out to be a brilliant brigade commander. In 1800, he distinguished himself at the Battle of Marengo, where his command of the left wing won particular praise from Napoleon. But Victor did not hide his disapproval of Napoleon's quest for political power, and as a result, received relatively minor roles under the new regime. In 1802, he was earmarked to lead an expedition to recover the French territory of Louisiana, but it was called off when Napoleon decided instead to sell Louisiana to the United States.
So Louisiana had been that Louisiana territory. First of all, let's acknowledge when we're talking about this, it's not like the French are occupying all of this land. There's trappers and traders and small military presence here and there, like especially down in New Orleans. But for the most part, this is Native American land, and it's wild. And the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, I think 1760s, it goes over to Spain. And Spain holds it for the next 40 years, and then when the Napoleonic Wars happen, France gets it back. But because of what's happened down in Haiti, where you had the slave revolt, and then Napoleon tries to take Haiti back, and that fails miserably, he decides that they've got their hands full on the continent with the wars of the coalitions. They can't be dealing with things in North America, and so he figures the most advantageous thing to do is to flip it, take this territory they've just reacquired, sell it to the United States.
Victor and Marshal Lannes were close friends from their days serving together in Italy. In 1806, Lannes persuaded Napoleon to let him have Victor as his new chief of staff for 5th Corps. Napoleon agreed, and in October, Victor served as Lannes' deputy at the Battle of Jena.
Chief of Staff is a position where, that's what Alexander Hamilton was for George Washington. He didn't have that title, but in effect, that's what he was. And a Chief of Staff is so important. These are your right-hand man. These are the people that you trust. Really, you pretty much trust them to exercise authority on your behalf when necessary. That's the level to which you need to be able to trust a Chief of Staff.
Napoleon's earlier misgivings about Victor were now forgotten, and that winter he was given command of the newly formed 10th Corps. But within weeks, he was captured by a Prussian patrol and had to be exchanged for a captured Prussian officer, General von Blücher. His big break came in 1807, stepping in for the wounded Marshal Bernadotte to command 1st Corps at Friedland, where he successfully led a major attack as the Emperor looked on. Promotion to Marshal and the title Duke of Bellumo swiftly followed. In 1808, Marshal Victor and 1st Corps took part in the invasion of Spain, where he'd be posted for the next 3 years. Victor's record in Spain was better than most.
I was going to say, nobody had a great record in Spain, other than Wellington.
But like others, he seemed more interested in personal glory and rewards than in cooperating with fellow commanders. In 1809 at Medellin, he inflicted a crushing defeat on General Cuesta's Spanish army. 4 months later, his bold night attack on the British at Talavera came tantalizingly close to success. He was furious the next day when King Joseph and Marshal Jourdan refused to support fresh attacks, and instead ordered a cautious withdrawal. The next year, Victor besieged the Spanish port of Cadiz. It proved a lengthy, futile operation, devoid of glory, and saw his troops defeated by an Allied sortie at the Battle of Barossa. In 1812, Victor was recalled from Spain for the invasion of Russia. His 9th Corps was held in reserve for most of the campaign, though his troops were kept busy defending depots and convoys from Cossack raids. That autumn, his corps attempted to cover the main army's retreat from Moscow. The greatest crisis of the retreat came at the Berezina River, as the remnants of the Grande Armée began crossing over 2 improvised bridges.
Some of these paintings are absolutely amazing when you look at the detail. Like, just look at how they've portrayed just the mass of humanity trying to cross this bridge, and the people that are on the other side and the ones that are in the water. It's really cool stuff.
As the remnants of the Grande Armée began crossing over 2 improvised bridges, Victor's 9th Corps was ordered to form the rear guard. Though heavily outnumbered, Victor skillfully handled his French and German troops, holding the Russians at bay as the army made its escape.
That's a tough gig, a rear guard in a desperate action to get across a river, because your men are going to be really tempted to look over their shoulders and say, you know what, we're dying while those guys escape, I'm out of here. So holding it together and holding a rear guard, especially coming out of Russia, that's tough. That's a tough gig.
He then marched his surviving troops over the bridges in good order. A courageous performance in desperate circumstances.
Yeah, that says a lot.
In Germany in 1813, Victor commanded 2nd Corps and led the attack in Napoleon's last great victory at Dresden. His corps was in heavy fighting again at Leipzig 2 months later. Victor continued to serve at the Emperor's side in the defense of France in 1814. By now, like many comrades, he must have been close to physical and psychological exhaustion. Regardless, during the Battle of Montereau, Napoleon let fly at him for failing to get his troops into position, and blamed him for the Allies' escape. Victor was relieved of command, but angry and humiliated at what he considered his unfair dismissal, he told the Emperor, "Marshal Victor has not forgotten his old trade. I will shoulder a musket and take my place in the guard."
Wow, dude.
Moved by this response, Napoleon relented and gave Victor command of a corps of young guard.
Wow.
2 weeks later, he was badly wounded at the Battle of Craon and took no further part in the war. A month later, Napoleon abdicated, and Victor switched his loyalty to the Bourbon monarchy with surprising zeal. He led an investigation into former comrades who'd supported Napoleon during the 100 Days, and was one of only 2 active marshals to vote for the death penalty for Marshal Ney,
Literally the opposite of Oudinot in this case.
Decision he later claimed to regret. Victor later served as Minister of War, but retired from public life in 1830, following the overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy. 10. Marshal Murat.
Now we're getting into some of the big boys. I cannot conceive how so brave a man could be so unreliable. He was only brave when facing the enemy. In council, he was a fool with no judgment. You know what? Some people are just made to be soldiers and they're not good at anything else. So maybe that's who Murat is.
Joachim Murat, the son of an innkeeper, was destined for a career in the church. but dropped out of college and joined a cavalry regiment instead. To his immense frustration, he saw little action in the early years of the Revolutionary Wars, being stuck with staff and training roles.
But sometimes, the staff roles end up being the way you get launched to a career. Dwight Eisenhower never led troops in combat, but he was always in staff roles. He was stateside during the First World War, but had staff roles after that and was recognized for his particular ability in that way, and that's where he ends up serving best.
But in 1795, while stationed in Paris with the 21st Chasseurs, fate intervened. A young general, Napoleon Bonaparte, had been put in charge of the defense of the National Convention. With a mob poised to storm the building, he ordered Captain Murat to bring him cannons, which he did, racing the guns through the city streets, allowing Napoleon to mow down the mob with a famous whiff of grape shot.
This is one of Napoleon's iconic moments, and this guy was key in that. Napoleon saw, hey, I gave him a task, he achieved it, he did it well, with enthusiasm. This is somebody I can rely on.
Napoleon was hailed as the savior of the government and rewarded with command of the army of Italy. Murat was promoted colonel and went with him as his new aide-de-camp. He soon made a name for himself as a bold and brilliant leader of cavalry, while his 6-foot height, curly locks, and love of women ensured fame as France's foremost beau sabreur. In 1798, Murat joined Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. At the Battle of Aboukir, his flanking charge broke the enemy, and Murat personally took the Ottoman commander prisoner, despite being shot in the jaw, a wound which, to his immense relief, did not ruin his looks. Back in Paris,
still okay with the ladies, Murat.
Napoleon launched his coup d'etat to seize political power. When he got a hostile reception from the Council of 500, it was Murat who saved the day, leading troops in to clear the chamber,
that was
shouting,
him.
"Citizens, you have been dissolved," before adding something a bit more coarse.
So a lot of these other marshals we've talked about so far have either stayed out of the coup or reluctantly kind of sided with it or, even opposed it. This guy not only supported it, he was at the head of the troops who helped make it happen.
His place at the future emperor's side was further assured when he
That's
married
right.
Napoleon's youngest sister, Caroline, in 1800. Later that year, he commanded the French cavalry reserve at Marengo and helped Napoleon to win a decisive victory over the Austrians. When Napoleon established his empire in 1804, Murat became a marshal, second in seniority only to Berthier. He'd later also receive the title Prince of the Empire and the rank of Grand Admiral.
So the prince that I'm curious to see if any of the others got prince that weren't married to a member of Napoleon's family.
In the 1805 campaign, he commanded Napoleon's cavalry reserve, his excellent reconnaissance and diversions proving crucial in the encirclement of General Mack's Austrian army at Ulm. 3 weeks later, Murat and Marshal Lannes, who normally couldn't stand each other, together bluffed an Austrian commander into surrendering a vital bridge by persuading him that an armistice had been signed when it hadn't. It was
That's
a bold
dirty.
stunt, but overall Napoleon was not impressed by Murat's pursuit of the enemy. "I cannot approve your manner of march. You go on like a stunned fool, taking not the least notice of my orders."
Ouch.
Yet in battle, Murat remained a brilliant and inspiring leader, as demonstrated at Austerlitz, and the next year at Jena, where he led the decisive charge, wielding only his riding crop. The next year at Eylau, with the Russians poised to break through his centre, Napoleon ordered Murat to lead a mass cavalry charge straight at the enemy. Murat's men succeeded and saved the army from disaster, though at a terrible price in men and horses. Napoleon had rewarded Murat in 1806 by making him sovereign prince of the Grand Duchy of Berg,
So, yeah, again, I mean, sovereign prince. So this is a title that comes with real authority. A lot of these titles are just titles, but you notice this is a right-hand man for Napoleon, because look at, like, he's at Austerlitz and Jena and Eylau and Borodino and Leipzig. These are some of the biggest battles Napoleon fights in, and Murat is right by his side. There's a reason that he arranged all these marriages for all the members of his family. He was big into nepotism, Napoleon was. So he obviously trusted this guy, even if he didn't necessarily always think the most highly of him as a commander.
In 1808, he sent Murat to Spain to act as his representative.
Trust.
Spain was still a French ally, but in May, Napoleon's heavy-handed meddling in Spanish affairs triggered a ferocious backlash. Madrid rose up against the French garrison, and Murat's troops fought back with brutal force, killing around 200, executing 300 more. When Napoleon deposed Spain's Bourbon monarchy, Murat hoped he'd be made the new king of Spain. But that title went to Napoleon's brother, Joseph. Murat instead received the throne of Naples. If it felt like second prize, it wasn't bad going for an innkeeper's son, college dropout, and ex-cavalry trooper.
Yeah, pretty good gig.
Napoleon expected Murat to merely represent his interests in Naples, but Murat had other ideas.
Oh, he's going to pull Bernadotte and say, you know what, you made me king of this territory. I got to represent these people now, not you. Oh, this happens so often in history.
He reformed the Neapolitan army, equipping it with splendid new uniforms, and turned a blind eye to smuggling, which undermined Napoleon's economic war against Britain,
which leads to the Russian campaign.
Relations between Murat and the emperor became strained. But when Napoleon began planning to invade Russia in 1812, only Murat would do to lead his cavalry. Their differences were put to one side. Murat took command of 4 cavalry corps and became Napoleon's second in command. During the advance into Russia, Murat's cavalry faced a difficult and frustrating task, trying to locate the enemy in a vast landscape. Horses died in their thousands from poor fodder and exhaustion, and they faced a dangerous and wily opponent in Russia's Cossacks. Murat, always riding with the advance guard, was so fearless and conspicuous in his extravagant uniforms that the Cossacks came to admire him, calling out "Ura, Murat!" whenever they saw him.
That's interesting.
And hoped to capture him alive if possible. Murat was
respect from his enemy and also admiration
among those who tried to persuade Napoleon to halt the advance at Smolensk, but was ignored.
Should have listened.
At the great clash between the French and Russian armies at Borodino, Murat was at his best, directing a series of attacks on the Russian earthworks, always where the action was hottest, inspiring all with his courage. Murat remained with the army during the retreat from Moscow, though his magnificent cavalry had virtually ceased to exist.
So one of the things that I find myself kind of mulling about in the back of my head is, as we're talking about these marshals, how many of them were at the front of the action and got wounded and weren't like sending troops in from the rear, even though they were high command. And I wonder how much of that has to do with the fact that these are guys who rose up through the ranks, who were privates and sergeants and lieutenants, and knew what it was like to fight on the front lines and had kind of made their bones that way. Whereas in a lot of other armies at this time, you're dealing with members of the nobility who have their position because of the family they were born into. And so they've always led from the rear, and so they're not used to doing that. I'm just wondering aloud how much that has to do with it.
One eyewitness noted that throughout the ordeal, he never neglected his appearance. Even at the Berezina, he looked splendid, in an open-necked shirt, velvet cloak, a white feather in his cap. When Napoleon left the army to return to Paris, he gave command to Marshal Murat. But Murat, now primarily concerned with hanging on to his kingdom, left the army a month later and returned to Naples, where he opened secret negotiations with the coalition. He offered to join the war against Napoleon if the other powers would let him keep his crown.
Totally pulling a Bernadotte. Boy, Napoleon, in hindsight, really messed up in giving these marshals these royalty claims. It backfired because these guys were like, ooh, I like this. I want to hang on to this, even if it means turning on Napoleon.
But he received only a lukewarm response. So in 1813, when Napoleon asked Murat to join him in Germany to fight for their thrones together, he answered the call. Murat had become increasingly difficult to work with, oversensitive about his royal status, prone to tantrums, but in battle as fearless as ever. At Dresden, his charge through rain and mud shattered the Austrian left wing and paved the way for victory. But then at Liebert-Volkwitz, he showed his limitations when not under Napoleon's direct command, getting drawn into a major and unnecessary cavalry battle with coalition forces, and twice nearly being captured himself. 2 days later, at the Battle of Leipzig, he led another of history's great cavalry charges, coming close to breaking the enemy centre and even capturing the Allied monarchs. But it was not to be. The Battle of the Nations ended in a disastrous defeat. As Napoleon retreated to the French frontier, Murat informed the emperor that he was leaving for Naples, promising to raise fresh troops. Murat and Napoleon would never meet again.
I'm going to raise fresh troops. What I'm really going to do, though, is hang on to my kingdom as best I can.
3 months later, the King of Naples had cut a deal with the coalition and switched sides. So long as it was possible for me to believe that the Emperor Napoleon was fighting to bring peace and glory to France, I fought loyally at his side, Murat declared. But now I know that the Emperor's sole desire is war.
That's not an unfair observation on Murat's part, because, as we mentioned earlier, there was an opportunity for Napoleon in the aftermath of Russia and in this fighting that's going on at Leipzig and places like that, where he could have negotiated a peace and held on to his throne, brought peace to France, and maybe, just maybe, things go differently. Now, maybe the coalition comes after him again anyway, and maybe that's what Napoleon thought, but I think this is a fair observation.
However, Murat's commitment to the Sixth Coalition was distinctly half-hearted. His army marched against Eugene's forces in northern Italy, but had done no actual fighting before news arrived of Napoleon's abdication. Murat then began to suspect what had been obvious to Napoleon at least. The coalition was not going to honour its promise, and Murat would be next to lose his throne. So, in 1815, encouraged by news of Napoleon's return from exile, Murat marched north against the Austrians, proclaiming a war for Italian freedom and independence. Just 7 weeks later, his campaign ended in defeat at the Battle of Tolentino. With the British and Austrians closing in, Murat became a hunted fugitive. He sailed to France, but Napoleon had not forgiven his betrayal and refused to see him. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, he fled to Corsica, gathered a small band of volunteers and
That's Napoleon's birthplace right there.
returned to Italy in a hopelessly doomed attempt to start a revolution and reclaim his throne.
Bad idea, dude.
Chased by a mob and arrested on the beach, Murat was sentenced to death by the restored Bourbon monarchy of Naples. He met his end with his usual courage, telling the firing squad, "If you wish to spare me, aim at the heart," then gave the order to fire himself.
That's how you go out like a boss right there. All right, that was really interesting, fascinating stuff. I learned a lot. Get a little bit better sense of who these guys are. We'll come back tomorrow with the next episode. We're probably also going to be doing a stream on Saturday, so maybe not Saturday, might be Sunday. We'll see how the day goes. But thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and we'll be back again with part 4 tomorrow.